The evenings in our neighborhood usually hummed with a quiet predictability. Sprinklers clicking on in rhythmic bursts, the distant bark of a dog settling down for the night, the low murmur of a television drifting from an open window. Mine included. At 47, living alone since Mark passed 5 years ago, routine had become both a comfort and a cage. I worked my job at the county records office, stable, quiet, predictable, much like my evenings, came home, made dinner for one, maybe read a book or lost myself in some old movie on TV. Rinse, repeat. My neighbor, Bob, was part of that predictable rhythm. Robert Kincaid, technically, lived next door for probably 15 years, though we'd only ever exchanged pleasantries over the shared hedge or waved as one of us pulled out of the driveway. He was maybe 10, 12 years older than me, retired from something involving engineering, I think someone once said. Kept his lawn immaculate, his house perfectly maintained. A quiet man, weathered face, usually wearing a baseball cap, often a simple navy blue one, sometimes one that said Vietnam veteran. He had a steady presence, solid as the old oak tree on his front lawn. We weren't friends, not really. Just neighbors. Ships passing politely in the suburban night. That particular evening started like any other late August night. The air was thick and warm, holding on to the day's heat, scented with dry grass, and the sweet perfume of the night sky petunias I had in pots on my small back patio. Crickets were tuning up their nightly symphony. I'd finished my solitary dinner and decided to tackle some deadheading on my rose bushes that lined the fence between our properties. It was therapeutic, the snip of the shears, the feel of the thorny stems, the velvety softness of a spent bloom in my hand. The setting sun painted the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, a spectacular show for an audience of one. I was lost in thought, probably murmuring something to a particularly stubborn cluster of faded blooms, a habit I'd picked up, talking to my plants like they were old friends, when I heard a soft cough behind me. I straightened up, startled, clutching my shears. Bob was standing just on his side of the low, chain-link fence, hands resting on the top rail. He wasn't usually out this late. His porch light cast long shadows, making his face hard to read initially. "Evening, Sarah," he said. His voice was low, a bit gravelly, as always. "Oh, Bob. Evening," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart was beating a little faster from the surprise. "Just tidying up the roses a bit." I gestured vaguely with the shears. "They look good this year," he observed, his gaze sweeping over the bushes. "You take good care of them." "Trying to," I smiled faintly. "They're a bit dramatic, but worth the effort." Usually, that would be the extent of it. A nod, maybe a comment about the impending weather, and we'd retreat to our separate spheres. But Bob didn't move. He just stood there, looking not quite at the roses, but more, past them, towards me. There was an unusual stillness about him. The usual comfortable distance suddenly felt charged with a low hum of something. Tension. Hesitation? I shifted my weight, suddenly self-conscious in my old gardening clothes, smudges of dirt probably on my cheek. "Everything all right, Bob?" He took a slow breath, his eyes finally meeting mine directly. They were a clear, pale blue, and tonight they looked troubled. No, not troubled. More like searching. "Sarah," he began, then stopped. He cleared his throat again. "There's something I've noticed. Been noticing for a while, actually." My mind raced. Had I let the grass get too long near the fence line? Was my recycling bin overflowing again? We'd never had any issues, not a single complaint in all these years. "Oh," I prompted, keeping my voice light, though a knot of apprehension was tightening in my stomach. He leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one else around. The intimacy of the gesture felt strange, unexpected. It's the way you talk to them. I blinked. I'm sorry. The roses, he clarified, nodding towards the bush I'd been tending. And the other plants sometimes. When you're out here, especially in the evenings, when you think no one's around. A flush crept up my neck. Oh, Lord. He'd heard my ridiculous one-sided conversations with the petunias and the stubborn rose bushes. How embarrassing. I probably sounded like a complete lunatic. I opened my mouth to stammer out some sort of explanation, maybe a self-deprecating joke. But he held up a hand, just a slight movement, stopping me. His expression wasn't mocking or amused. It was serious, deeply serious. And there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes that silenced my embarrassment. Don't, he said softly. Don't be embarrassed. That's not why I'm saying this. He paused, gathering his thoughts, the crickets seeming to chirp louder in the sudden silence. The porch light caught the silver in his hair. Then he looked right at me, his gaze steady and intense, and said the words that completely knocked the breath out of me, setting the stage for a night unlike any I could have ever imagined. It's just, I think I understand why you do it. And I need to tell you something I haven't told another living soul. I just stood there, shears dangling forgotten from my hand, the scent of crushed rose leaves sharp in the cooling air. Stunned. Bob Kincaid, the quiet man next door, the keeper of the perfect lawn, understood why I talked to my plants? And he had a secret. The crickets suddenly seemed deafening, each chirp drilling into the thick silence that stretched between us. I don't understand, Bob, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The knot in my stomach tightened, but it wasn't entirely apprehension anymore. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through it. He shifted his weight, his gaze dropped into his hands resting on the fence rail. His knuckles were prominent, the skin weathered, showing years of work and sun. It's hard to explain, he murmured, looking back up. The porch light caught the lines etched around his pale blue eyes. Lines of experience, maybe sadness too. Seeing you out here reminded me of Eleanor. Eleanor, his wife. She passed away maybe 7 or 8 years ago, before Mark. I hadn't known her well, just the occasional wave, a brief chat about the weather. She'd been frail towards the end. Bob had cared for her tirelessly. The whole neighborhood knew that. He rarely mentioned her. She used to talk to the birds, he continued, a faint, almost invisible smile touching his lips. Not just tossing breadcrumbs. She'd have full conversations. Told them about her day, asked them if they'd seen anything interesting on their travels. Especially the cardinals. She loved the cardinals. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the darkening sky, as if he might spot one even now. I used to tease her about it, gently, you know. Called them her feathered confidants. But towards the end, when she couldn't get out much, those birds, those conversations, they were vital for her. Kept a part of her alive, I think. A part that needed to connect, even when the world shrank down to just the view from the window. My breath hitched. I thought of my own quiet evenings, the low murmur of the television failing to fill the silence left by Mark, the way tending my garden felt like the only conversation that mattered sometimes. It wasn't about expecting the roses to answer back. It was about voicing things. Putting feelings out into the world, even if only the rustling leaves and the setting sun bore witness. And after she was gone, Bob went on, his voice dropping lower, rougher with emotion. The silence in the house. It was immense, deafening. Sometimes I'd find myself standing at the window where she used to sit, watching the bird feeder. And I'd start talking to them too. He looked directly at me then, a raw honesty in his eyes that held me captive. Not like Eleanor did. Not full conversations. Just acknowledging them. Morning red, I might say to a cardinal. Or busy day to the sparrow squabbling over seed. Stupid, maybe. But it felt necessary. Like pushing back against the emptiness. He shook his head slightly, a self-conscious gesture. So when I hear you, Sarah, talking to your roses, I don't hear crazy. I hear, I don't know. Someone making their way through the quiet. Someone keeping connection alive, even if it's just with a stubborn bloom. The air vibrated with his confession. The simple, profound admission hung between us, more intimate than any shared cup of coffee or neighborhood barbecue ever could be. My embarrassment had completely vanished, replaced by a wave of unexpected empathy. Here was this man, this quiet neighbor I'd barely known, revealing a hidden piece of his grief, his loneliness, mirroring my own unspoken feelings in a way I couldn't have anticipated. "Bob," I said softly, finding my voice again. "I thank you for telling me that. It's not stupid at all. I think I understand what you mean." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, relief softening the lines around his eyes. We stood there for another moment, the shared understanding a fragile bridge built across the fence, across years of polite distance. The orange and purple had faded from the sky, leaving behind a deep, velvety indigo pricked with the first few stars. His porch light seemed to cast a warmer glow now. "But that's not the main thing I wanted to tell you," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier intensity. He took another breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into deep water. "What I needed to say, it's something Eleanor told me years ago. Something she made me promise not to repeat, but seeing you, it feels important, necessary, like talking to the birds." He hesitated, searching my face, perhaps gauging my reaction, perhaps steeling himself. The crickets chirped on, oblivious. The air felt charged again, expectation crackling beneath the calm surface of the suburban night. Whatever he was about to say, I knew, instinctively, that it was going to change more than just the quiet rhythm of my evenings. It felt like the shifting of tectonic plates, slow, deep, and irreversible. "She told me about..." He started, then stopped, his gaze locking with mine, holding an astonishing mix of vulnerability and resolve. "She told me about a night, long before I knew her, a night that changed everything for her. And hearing you, it made me realize, maybe you're the only other person who might understand." Understand? Me? What could Eleanor Kincaid, a woman I barely knew, have experienced that Bob thought I, Sarah Jenkins, the quiet widow next door, would uniquely comprehend? My mind was blank, unable to conjure possibilities. The night felt suddenly very still, the crickets chirping fading into a background hum as I focused entirely on Bob, waiting. The scent of my roses seemed stronger, heavier. Bob leaned a little closer to the fence, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost conspiratorial, yet heavy with the weight of memory. "Eleanor. She wasn't always the quiet woman knitting by the window that most folks around here remember. When she was younger, much younger, before we met, she went through a rough patch. Her first fiancé. He didn't come back from Korea. It shattered her." I nodded slowly. That kind of loss. Yes, that I understood. The gaping hole left behind, the world turned gray and silent. She kind of drifted. Bob continued, his gaze distant, seeing the past. Moved away from her family for a while, took a job in a small coastal town way up north. Didn't know a soul. She said it was the loneliest time of her life. Lonelier even than the grief, in a way, because the grief at least felt active. This was just emptiness. He paused, rubbing his thumb along the top wire of the fence. She worked as a waitress in this little diner. Long hours, barely scraping by. Nights were the worst. She lived in a tiny rented room above a shop. Nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant foghorn. He looked back at me, his pale eyes searching mine again. One night, there was a terrible storm. Wind howling, rain lashing down, power went out in most of the town. She was terrified, huddled in her little room, feeling completely cut off, utterly alone. Said she felt like she was going to just dissolve into the darkness. The image was vivid, chilling. I could almost feel the cold, the fear, the crushing weight of isolation she must have felt. Then, Bob said, his voice softening, there was a knock at her door. My heart gave a little jump. In a storm? Power out. She almost didn't answer, but it was persistent. Not frantic, just steady. She finally cracked the door open. It was the old man who ran the bookshop downstairs. Mr. Abernathy. A recluse, mostly. Barely spoke 2 words to anyone, always buried in his books. Bob shifted, leaning his forearms on the fence now. He was standing there in the dark hallway, holding a candle stub in a saucer. Dripping wax onto his hand, probably. He just looked at her and said, clear as a bell over the wind, the storm's quite fierce, isn't it? Terrible to be alone in such weather. I've made some tea. Would you care for a cup? By candlelight. Bob let out a slow breath. Eleanor said she just stared at him. This man she barely knew, this quiet, solitary figure. And in that moment, seeing the candlelight flicker on his face, hearing his calm voice, she felt this overwhelming sense of, not rescue, exactly, but connection, a lifeline thrown across the dark. He looked down, a faint tremor in his hand. She went down to his shop. It was filled with shadows, books stacked everywhere, the scent of old paper and dust, and the hot tea he'd brewed on a little camping stove. They didn't talk much, not really. He read poetry aloud by candlelight. Tennyson, she thought it was. His voice was surprisingly resonant. She just listened, sipping the tea, watching the shadows dance on the walls. The storm raged outside, but inside that little cocoon of candlelight and quiet words, she said she felt safe, seen, not entirely alone anymore. He fell silent. The crickets resumed their insistent rhythm. The streetlight at the corner cast long, skeletal shadows from the trees. I realized I was holding my breath. It wasn't a shocking story in the way I might have braced myself for. No scandal, no huge drama. But it was profoundly intimate. A simple, unexpected human connection in a moment of deep vulnerability. 2 lonely souls finding brief, shared solace in a storm. She never forgot that night, Bob said quietly. She said it didn't magically fix her grief or her loneliness, but it shifted something inside her, made her realize that connection could appear in the most unexpected ways, from the most unexpected people, that you just had to be open to cracking the door open, even when you're scared. He looked straight at me, his expression earnest. She told me that story maybe 20 years into our marriage. Said she kept it close because it felt so personal, so defining in a quiet way, and she made me promise not to share it lightly. But Bob paused, searching for the right words. "Hearing you talk to your flowers, Sarah." It reminded me of her talking to the birds, and it reminded me of Mr. Abernethy offering tea in the dark. Finding connection where you can, pushing back the silence. He sighed, a deep sound that seemed to carry years of unspoken thoughts. I guess I just wanted you to know that I see you, and that maybe it's okay to find solace in quiet conversations, whether it's with roses or birds, or even a neighbor over the fence on a warm night. The confession hung in the air, simple, profound, and utterly unexpected. He hadn't just shared Eleanor's story. He'd shared a piece of his understanding, his empathy. He'd seen my quiet coping mechanism not as eccentricity, but as a kindred act of seeking connection. And in telling me Eleanor's story, he had, like Mr. Abernethy, offered a quiet companionship in the face of the loneliness we both, in our own ways, navigated. The space between our houses, usually just a strip of lawn and a chain-link fence, suddenly felt like hallowed ground, consecrated by shared vulnerability and the ghost of a decades-old kindness offered during a storm. The weight of Bob's words of Eleanor's story settled around me. It wasn't heavy like grief, but grounding, like a warm blanket on a cool evening. He hadn't just told me a story. He'd offered me a rare glimpse into his own heart, into the quiet landscape of his marriage and his loss. He'd seen my lonely, slightly eccentric habit, and instead of judgment, had offered understanding rooted in his own experience. It was an act of profound kindness, unexpected and deeply moving. "Bob." I started, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't anticipated. I cleared my throat, wanting him to understand how much his sharing meant. "That's one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. Sharing that. Trusting me with Eleanor's memory, with your own feelings." I looked across the fence, meeting his gaze directly in the soft glow of his porch light. "Thank you. Really, it means more than I can say." A small smile touched his lips again, reaching his eyes this time, crinkling the corners. Eleanor always said connection finds its way. Like water. Sometimes it just needs a little channel opened up. He gestured vaguely between us, between our 2 yards, our 2 solitary lives. Guess she was right. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, a silence that felt entirely different from the polite, slightly awkward silences that had punctuated our previous 15 years as neighbors. The crickets chirped, the leaves on the maple tree rustled in a sudden breeze, the distant hum of the city felt miles away. It was just us, 2 people standing by a fence line under the vast, starry sky, having bypassed years of superficiality in a single, heartfelt conversation. I finally remembered the shears in my hand and carefully placed them in the empty terracotta pot beside me. The gesture felt like setting down a burden, letting go of some of the tight self-containment I'd wrapped around myself since Mark died. Bob straightened up from the fence, stretching slightly. "Well," he said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming lighter, though still warm. "Getting late. Probably should let you get back to, well, whatever you were doing before I interrupted your gardening therapy." "It's all right," I said quickly. This was much better than deadheading roses, believe me. He chuckled softly, a pleasant, rumbling sound. "Good to know." He paused, seeming to hesitate for just a fraction of a second, then plunged ahead, much like he must have done when starting the conversation. "Sarah, I usually make a pot of coffee around 9 in the morning. Read the paper out on my back deck, if the weather's nice. Nothing fancy." He looked at me, a question in his eyes, but also a simple, open invitation. "If you're ever not busy, if you feel like some company, you'd be welcome to join me. Sometime." There it was. the unexpected turn. Not a grand declaration, not a life-altering event in the dramatic sense, but something small, simple, and utterly revolutionary in the context of our neighboring lives. Coffee. Company. An open door offered gently, without pressure, just like Mr. Abernathy's tea offered to Eleanor in the storm. It was Bob extending a hand across the quiet loneliness, acknowledging the shared need for connection he'd so eloquently spoken of. My heart did a little flip, a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the lingering August heat. 5 years I'd lived here alone, keeping mostly to myself, letting the silence grow. And now, this. An invitation sparked by talking roses and shared vulnerability. Bob, I said, a genuine smile blooming on my face, feeling as natural and welcome as the evening primrose opening nearby. I'd like that very much. Thank you. Relief washed over his face, clear even in the dim light. Good, he said simply. No pressure. Just whenever. I'll keep that in mind, I replied, meaning it. He gave a final nod, a gesture that now felt like camaraderie rather than dismissal. Well then, good night, Sarah. Good night, Bob, I echoed softly. He turned and walked back towards his house, his steps steady on the flagstone path. The screen door creaked softly as he went inside, and a moment later, the warm glow appeared in his kitchen window. I stood there for a long time after he'd gone, looking at the roses, at the fence, at the quiet house next door that suddenly felt less like a separate territory and more like part of the same landscape. The night air felt different, lighter, somehow charged with possibility. What my neighbor said that night truly did leave me stunned. Not just the story of Eleanor and Mr. Abernathy, but the quiet courage it took for him to share it, the empathy he showed, the simple, human connection he offered. It wasn't just about him understanding why I talked to my plants. It was about him seeing me, the person behind the routine, behind the quiet facade. And in doing so, he'd made me feel less invisible, less alone. No, you probably wouldn't believe what happened, because it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, intimate, and happened over a garden fence on an ordinary Tuesday night. But it changed something fundamental. It cracked open a door I hadn't even realized was closed so tightly. As I finally turned to go inside, leaving the sleeping roses under the stars, I knew my predictable evenings might just start looking a little different. Maybe tomorrow, around 9, they would. And that felt like a quiet miracle all its own.